What the Studios Buried. 14 Golden Age Idols with Chilling Secret Lives. Golden Age Hollywood. A timeless paradise of blinding glamour, flawless smiles, and silver screen heroes who felt like gods among men. But away from the flashing cameras and behind the heavily guarded iron gates of major studios, a much darker, terrifying reality was being aggressively buried. Millions worshipped these legendary icons, completely blind to the chilling psychological warfare, domestic tyranny, and systemic abuse operating just outside the frame. The high-profile snapshots of perfect families and immaculate virtues were nothing more than a masterclass in corporate marketing, orchestrated by predatory studio fixers whose only job was to silence the victims and protect the prophets. What you are about to discover will forever shatter your nostalgia and completely change is how you look at classic cinema history. These are the dark dashes the industry fought for decades to keep in the shadows. Before we unseal the vaults and count down these chilling double lives from the most influential to the deeply tragic, make sure to subscribe to the archive. Hit that notification bell right now to join our community, unlock exclusive access to history's most fiercely guarded secrets, and never miss our upcoming investigative deep dives. Now, let's reveal what the studios buried. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was hailed as Hollywood's ultimate boy wonder, a towering creative force who single-handedly reshaped the canvas of American cinema with his 1941 masterpiece, Citizen Kane. Yet, behind the brilliant composition of his lenses lay a devastatingly sharp tongue and an unchecked ego that slowly corroded his relationships from the inside out. In private conversations recorded later in his life with director Henry Jaglom, the veil of eccentric genius slipped away to reveal an embittered patriarch, wielding pure contempt against his peers. Welles did not merely critique his contemporaries. He sought to entirely dismantle their legacies with verbal cruelty. He dismissed the legendary Bette Davis as fundamentally unwatchable, labeled the revered Laurence Olivier as intellectually dim, and shrugged off Charlie Chaplin, the very foundation of cinematic comedy, as a petty narcissist. Even the deeply respected Spencer Tracy was brushed aside as a second-rate presence. This toxic arrogance was not confined to private audio tapes. It directly infected his film sets. Welles demanded absolute, dictatorial control over every frame, relentlessly overriding producers, alienating studio executives, and picking fights that permanently halted productions. His masterpieces, including the magnificent Ambersons and Touch of Evil, were plagued by stories of intense isolation, emotional warfare, and bridge burning that left collaborators deeply traumatized. As the industry evolved and younger talents took center stage, Welles's refusal to compromise transformed him into a bitter, reclusive exile. He spent his final decade struggling to secure funding for his unfinished visions, blaming a conspiratorial studio system, while ignoring the wreckage his own mouth had created. The director, who masterfully captured shadows on screen, was ultimately consumed by his own, leaving behind a cinematic empire built on the casualties of his unyielding malice. Joan Crawford was the quintessential manifestation of silver screen glamour, possessing sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, and an icy elegance that commanded the absolute devotion of millions. Her public persona was carefully manufactured as a symbol of resilience, and her high-profile adoptions of 4 children were broadcast across national magazines as a masterclass in maternal devotion. However, the pristine, orchestrated snapshots of family bliss concealed a harrowing psychological minefield for those living inside her mansion. Just 1 year after her passing in 1977, her adopted daughter Christina published Mommy Dearest, shattering the carefully curated illusion and exposing a domestic regime ruled by terrifying control and explosive violence. According to her children, Crawford was a woman obsessed with perfection to the point of severe mania, transforming her home into a private theater of trauma. Minor infractions met with brutal psychological games, late-night screaming episodes, and physical punishments, including the infamous violent rages sparked by the discovery of wire hangers in a closet. Her son Christopher later confirmed these accounts, describing an upbringing defined by a constant state of terror under a mother whose affection was entirely conditional. While Crawford was donating to charities and smiling for studio cameras, her children were treated as mere set pieces in her off-screen marketing strategy. Love was weaponized as a tool for compliance, and any deviation from her strict standards resulted in immediate emotional excommunication. Even as Hollywood gathered to mourn its fallen queen with lavish tributes, her final will delivered one last calculated blow, completely cutting her eldest children out of her estate. Crawford won an Academy Award for her brilliance on screen, but her obsessive need to dominate every soul around her ultimately cost her the genuine devotion of her family. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas stood as an unyielding pillar of post-war American masculinity, a rugged, dimple-chinned icon who brought fierce conviction to legendary heroes like Spartacus. He presented himself as a champion of justice, famously breaking the Hollywood blacklist by insisting on screen credit for writer Dalton Trumbo. Yet away from the roaring applause of the box office, Douglas operated with a ruthless intensity that left a trail of deep resentment and dark whispers in his wake. On film sets, his passion frequently curdled into absolute tyranny. He viewed directors not as creative partners, but as obstacles to his personal vision. During the production of Spartacus, he unilaterally fired the original director within a single week, and on Paths of Glory, he locked horns with a young Stanley Kubrick, aggressively demanding scenes be rewritten to satisfy his own ego. His overbearing nature earned him the reputation of being one of the most unpopular men in the industry, an honor he openly wore like a badge of pride. Far darker, however, was the heavy silence that shielded his private life for decades. Following his death at the age of 103, the long-standing rumors surrounding his treatment of women broke into the open when Lana Wood publicly named Douglas as the individual who had allegedly inflicted severe trauma on her teenage sister, Natalie Wood, during the mid-1950s. For generations, the Hollywood studio system actively deployed its immense resources to bury such allegations, prioritizing the financial value of a leading man's image over human accountability. Douglas lived a century-long life of immense privilege, building a monument to his own heroism on celluloid while leaving behind real-world shadows that time refuses to erase. Judy Garland followed the yellow brick road straight into cultural immortality, capturing the heart of humanity with her soulful eyes and a heartbreakingly beautiful voice that could shatter an audience. But behind the magical curtain of The Wizard of Oz, there was no wizard to save her. Only a predatory studio apparatus that viewed her youth as a highly profitable commodity to be strip-mined. Swept into the relentless MGM machine as an insecure teenager, Garland was systematically subjected to psychological torture by executives who constantly berated her physical appearance, labeling her an unattractive misfit. To keep their young star working exhausting 20-hour shifts, studio handlers began feeding her a toxic cocktail of prescription chemicals. They forced amphetamines down her throat to wake her up and suppress her appetite, followed by heavy barbiturates to knock her out when the cameras stopped rolling. This engineered cycle of chemical dependency completely fractured her developing a psyche before she was even old enough to vote. Her handlers monitored her weight with psychotic scrutiny, rationing her food and stripping away any semblance of a normal childhood. As Garland grew older, the emotional fractures deepened into severe exhaustion, profound isolation, and a string of chaotic marriages. Yet the studio system remained completely indifferent to her suffering. When her inevitable psychological collapses began to interfere with production schedules, the very industry that had manufactured her addiction cold-bloodedly discarded her, leaving her to spiral into financial ruin. She spent her final years performing in small, smoke-filled clubs, a tragic ghost of America's sweetheart, before dying entirely alone in a rented London flat at just 47. Garland's life was not a story of personal malice, but a harrowing warning of how Hollywood creates immortal dreams by completely destroying real lives. Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby possessed a velvet baritone that could soothe a war-torn nation, embodying the ultimate symbol of wholesome American fatherhood through his timeless holiday anthems and pipe-smoking patriarch persona. To a public desperate for stability, Crosby was a comforting anchor of clean family values and structured discipline. However, when the studio spotlights were extinguished, the warm, grandfatherly smile vanished, replaced by an emotionally frozen disciplinarian who ruled his household through absolute terror. In his explosive 1983 memoir Going My Own Way, his eldest son, Gary Crosby, exposed the severe domestic tyranny disguised as righteous parenting. The home was described not as a sanctuary of love, but as a rigid military compound where Crosby enforced obedience using leather belts, razor strops, and physical violence. The legendary singer routinely subjected his young boys to blistering verbal humiliation, mocking their physical appearance, posture, and self-worth until they were completely broken. Crosby never denied his severe methods, callously justifying the cruelty as a necessary shield to protect his offspring from the corrupting influence of Hollywood wealth. The psychological collateral damage of this abusive upbringing was devastatingly absolute. Gary spent decades battling severe substance abuse, while his younger brother Lindsay ultimately took his own life, unable to escape the profound emotional wounds inflicted by their father. Crosby passed away peacefully on a golf course, with his pristine public legacy entirely intact, leaving his traumatized children to carry the heavy, unspoken cost of America's favorite Christmas illusion. Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda was the cinematic incarnation of the American conscience, projecting an unshakable moral rectitude in landmark films like The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men. His quiet, deliberate line delivery and stoic presence convinced audiences that he was a man of profound depth and decency. Yet, inside his own home, that celebrated stoicism transformed into a terrifying, suffocating, emotional vacuum that deeply scarred his children, Jane and Peter. Fonda was a man completely paralyzed by his own internal coldness, choosing to wield absolute silence as a weapon of domestic control. Jane Fonda later confessed that she could not recall a single instance of sustained warm eye contact from her father throughout her entire childhood, while Peter described him as a detached silhouette who was far more present on movie screens than at the family dinner table. Fonda withheld affection and validation with a calculated rigidity that proved far more damaging than outright physical rage. His private life was a revolving door of 5 volatile marriages and a succession of unrepentant extramarital affairs, often involving vulnerable young actresses who were easily blinded by his immense star power. While the public cheered his on-screen battles for justice and human rights, his family lived in an emotional desert, constantly starving for a shred of genuine approval. Both of his children eventually channeled their profound parental trauma into their own artistic careers, using the silver screen to seek the attention their father refused to give them at home. Fonda died wrapped in national honors. Having spent his life masterfully portraying ideals he utterly failed to practice under his own roof. Mickey Rooney was the energetic dynamo of early Hollywood, a pint-sized box office king whose boundless charisma in the Andy Hardy series made him the definitive poster boy for wholesome youth. The industry showered him with wealth and adulation before he reached adulthood, fostering a monstrous, unchecked ego that grew increasingly toxic as his youthful appeal began to fade. Behind his cheerful on-screen grin lay a deeply abrasive, deeply resentful man who demanded that every room he entered revolve entirely around his needs. On film sets, Rooney was notorious for his condescending and intensely jealous treatment of rising stars. During the production of National Velvet, he actively targeted a young Elizabeth Taylor with verbal dismissals, later bitterly waving her off as an untalented product of studio privilege. His volatile private life descended into a chaotic minefield of 8 distinct marriages, plagued by persistent accusations of emotional manipulation and verbal abuse. Rooney burned through multiple fortunes with reckless entitlement, and by the 1960s, the former child star was entirely bankrupt both financially and morally. Rather than adapting to a changing industry, he clung fiercely to his outdated status, lashing out at anyone who failed to treat him like royalty. His professional legacy remains permanently tarnished by his performance in Breakfast at Tiffany's, where he utilized an offensive, highly stereotyped caricature of an Asian landlord. Rooney completely brushed off the mounting cultural backlash with arrogant laughter, embodying a tragic archetype of a star who was deeply ruined by early entitlement and utterly incapable of growing up. Faye Dunaway. Faye Dunaway electrified the cinema of the new Hollywood era, bringing a fierce, magnetic brilliance to iconic masterpieces like Bonnie and Clyde, Chinatown, and Network. She specialized in portraying cold, calculating, and ruthless women who would stop at nothing to achieve absolute dominance. Tragically, for the crews and co-stars who had to work alongside her, that on-screen coldness was not an act. It was a highly volatile reality that routinely turned film sets into absolute chaos. Dunaway earned a terrifying reputation as one of the most difficult and explosive divas in theatrical history, leaving a trail of intense psychological exhaustion wherever she worked. During a stage production in the 1990s, she stunned the cast by physically slapping a fellow actor across the face during a scene, an unchoreographed, entirely unnecessary assault driven purely by her need for control. Wardrobe assistants and wig designers recalled her erupting into violent rages over minor technical details, occasionally striking hands and screaming profanities at subordinates. On the legendary set of Chinatown, her explosive arguments with director Roman Polanski became Hollywood folklore, culminating in a notorious incident where she allegedly threw a cup of her own urine directly at his face. After being denied a bathroom break, her peers openly recoiled from her behavior. Actor James Woods publicly labeled her the most difficult co-star of his career, while the legendary Bette Davis bluntly named Dunaway as the single most nightmare-inducing actress in the entire industry. Dunaway possessed a rare, searing talent, but her legacy is permanently overshadowed by the human wreckage she left behind long after the director yelled cut. Errol Flynn was the definitive cinematic swashbuckler, leaping across the silver screen as Robin Hood with a blinding smile and a devil-may-care charisma that captured the imagination of the world. He lived his private life with the exact same reckless acceleration, commanding a fleet of luxury yachts and hosting wild, champagne-fueled orgies that burned through the Hollywood nights. Yet beneath the glittering facade of the ultimate romantic rebel lay a predatory and deeply manipulative operator who treated human beings as disposable playthings. Flynn deliberately gathered chaos around himself, showing an utter indifference to the emotional and physical safety of the young women swept into his orbit. In 1942, the glamorous illusion completely shattered when 2 teenage girls stepped forward, accusing the movie star of statutory rape. The subsequent trial transformed into an absolute media circus, exposing the massive divide between the heroic icon on the screen and the deeply predatory man in the courtroom. Though a starstruck jury ultimately acquitted him, the dark stain on his character was permanent. Industry insiders routinely described Flynn as a cruel manipulator who became dangerous when bored, callously dismissing the tears of those he harmed as mere female melodrama. His heavy reliance on alcohol and narcotics eventually took a devastating physical toll, aggressively carving deep lines into his legendary boyish features. By his late 40s, he resembled a hollow ghost dressed up in his old costumes, collapsing dead at 50 with a drink in his hand. A man who spent his life playing the hero while turning the lives of others into complete tragedies. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power was the ultimate matinee idol of the 1930s and 40s, possessing a breathtakingly handsome face that made him the undisputed king of romantic technicolor adventures like The Mark of Zorro. Women openly swooned at his cinematic presence, and 20th Century Fox guarded his masculine, heroic image with an iron fist. However, the flawless romantic hero presented to the public was forced to live a highly secretive, deeply fractured double life behind the studio's protective curtain. Power was caught in a grueling cycle of marital manipulation and intense, emotional detachment, using his 3 high-profile marriages as convenient public shields to conceal his fluid sexuality. In an era where exposure would immediately destroy a career, he engaged in a series of clandestine affairs with both men and women, orchestrating a complex network of lies to maintain his box office value. This constant state of performance took a devastating emotional toll, transforming Power into a cold, intensely distant partner who viewed his wives and lovers as mere chess pieces in a high-stakes game of public relations. He wielded his immense charm as a calculating tool of control, ice-coldly severing relationships the moment they threatened to breach his security. The intense pressure of maintaining this absolute deception, combined with heavy chain smoking and grueling physical schedules, severely weakened his heart. He suffered a fatal heart attack on a film set at the young age of 44, dying as a tragic casualty of an era that forced its greatest beauties to trade their authentic humanity for an unblemished, manufactured myth. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a comedic genius of unparalleled proportions, a brilliant chameleon who completely dissolved into iconic characters like Inspector Clouseau and the multi-voiced cast of Dr. Strangelove. He possessed a dazzling gift for mimicry that kept global audiences laughing for decades. Yet those who dared to step close to him discovered an empty, deeply unstable shell. Sellers famously confessed that he had absolutely no core identity of his own, stating that he could only exist when hiding behind the mask of a fictional character. This profound psychological void manifested as a terrifying regime of domestic manipulation and volatile erraticism. He lived under the absolute control of deep compulsions, maintaining a bizarre, morbid shrine to his deceased mother and claiming to receive spiritual directives from her ghost. On film sets, his creative brilliance was constantly matched by his capacity for psychological warfare. He would erupt into unprovoked rages, entirely ghosting rehearsals and rewriting scripts on a whim. During the production of The Party, his relationship with director Blake Edwards turned so toxic that Sellers completely refused to speak to him, communicating solely through terrified assistants. His private life was a chaotic graveyard of 4 ruined marriages, defined by a pattern of showering partners with intense affection, before instantly cutting them out with chilling. Sellers suffered a series of massive heart attacks, as his internal chaos literally tore his physical body apart, leaving the world to mourn a clown who could make millions laugh, but could never find a single moment of peace within his own fractured mind. Milton Berle was affectionately known as Uncle Milty, a brash, cigar-chomping force of nature who single-handedly built the foundation of early American television. In the late 1940s and 50s, his slapstick antics on the Texaco Star Theater were so fundamentally dominant that movie theaters across the nation would literally close their doors during his broadcast hour. Berle wielded an immense, unprecedented industry power, but he also possessed a titanic, unyielding ego that completely refused to adapt as the medium evolved past his vaudevillian roots. By the late 1970s, his loud, aggressive style of comedy had become an outdated relic, a reality his massive pride fiercely rejected. When he was invited to host Saturday Night Live in 1979, the young, edgy cast intended the episode as a respectful tribute to a television pioneer. Instead, Berle aggressively bulldozed the entire production from the very first rehearsal, treating the contemporary writers and actors with complete and utter disdain. He repeatedly hijacked sketches, deliberately mugged for the cameras to steal punchlines from his co-stars, and barked orders at the crew like a mid-century dictator. The disastrous episode culminated in Burrell staging a pre-arranged, wildly sentimental standing ovation for himself, completely horrifying the show's creator, Lorne Michaels. The behavior was so toxic that Wholesome completely banned the episode from ever being aired in standard reruns. Burley's historic television legacy remains permanently shadowed by his final decades, displaying the tragic spectacle of an entertainment titan whose unchecked arrogance transformed him into the industry's most unwelcome guest. Wallace Beery. Wallace Beery was one of MGM's most incredibly bankable stars during the 1950s, capturing the hearts of millions as the gruff, lovable, and soft-hearted curmudgeon in cinematic classics like The Champ. Audiences completely adored his familiar, square-jawed face, firmly believing he was a gentle teddy bear beneath his rough exterior. In horrifying reality, Beery was a deeply violent, short-tempered bully who wielded his immense studio power as a weapon to terrorize everyone on set. He harbored a psychotic hatred for young, rising talent. A young Mickey Rooney later vividly recalled being viciously manhandled and physically bruised by Beery on the set of Slave Ship, simply for accidentally upstaging the older actor. Crew members lived in a constant state of anxiety, carefully treading around his volatile, unpredictable moods. Far darker, however, was the thick shroud of criminal suspicion that permanently stained his legacy. In 1937, the popular vaudeville comedian Ted Healy was brutally beaten to death outside a Hollywood nightclub, and numerous insider accounts firmly placed Beery as one of the primary physical perpetrators of the assault. Rather than allowing their top box office draw to face a criminal investigation, MGM executives immediately intervened, cold-bloodedly sending Beery on an emergency vacation to Europe while pulling strings to bury the official police reports. Beery died in 1949, surrounded by manufactured studio praise, a protected monster who used his cinematic warmth to completely mask a real world. History of domestic and physical tyranny. Gary Crosby. Gary Crosby did not enter the annals of Hollywood history as a malicious predator or a tyrannical diva, but rather as the ultimate, tragic casualty of golden age celebrity pathology. Born into the apex of American entertainment royalty as the eldest son of the globally adored Bing Crosby, Gary's entire existence was engineered to serve as a marketing accessory for his father's pristine public image. Behind the polished mansion doors, however, he was subjected to a systematic campaign of physical and psychological degradation. He was routinely beaten with leather straps and razor strops, and targeted with relentless verbal abuse regarding his weight and self-worth by a father who demanded absolute submission. When Gary courageously published his harrowing 1983 memoir, Going My Own Way, he broke the generational silence, offering a raw, bleeding confession of the trauma inflicted by a national icon. The immediate public backlash was fierce. A star-struck nation accused Gary of bitter exploitation, callously weaponizing his grief against him to protect their favorite holiday singer. This institutional gaslighting trapped Gary in a perpetual emotional prison. Despite his own genuine talents in singing and acting, the industry continuously reduced him to nothing more than Bing's bitter boy. He spent his adult life wrestling with severe alcoholism and profound emotional scars, witnessing his brother Lindsay sink into the same inherited darkness. Gary's life stands as a powerful testament to the devastating human cost of Hollywood manufacturing. A child who was forced to live as a prisoner inside a palace of applause, speaking his truth only to sit to discover that the world proved the warmth of a manufactured lie.